Hello, this is David Cairns for Radio VR in Washington. After Sunday's presidential election, Ukraine has a new president-elect, but by all indications, the election has not solved the crisis in the country. On Tuesday, Maidan's acting first deputy prime minister, Vitaly Yarema, confirmed that military operations to suppress the protesters in the eastern regions will continue until they are completely subdued. This posture should certainly alarm the international community. First, it portends great bloodshed. Probably more than 100 people in the eastern regions have died during Kiev's assaults since Sunday. Second, Kiev is avoiding the obligations accepted in the Geneva Agreement of April 17th. Speaking at a joint press conference with Turkey's Foreign Minister Davutoglu in Moscow on Tuesday, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Ukraine must cease military operations in the eastern provinces immediately and do what the Ukrainian authorities constantly demand of others. They should fulfill the requirements of the Geneva Agreement of April 17th, which included a cessation of violence and the pursuit of a resolution of the protests exclusively through peaceful negotiations. We urgently call on the Ukrainian authorities to follow this path, and if they do so, we are sure that the people of eastern and southern Ukraine will respond favorably. We expect that President Poroshenko will act in the best interest of the Ukrainian people, and if he does so, he can be sure that he will find Russia to be a serious and reliable partner. That was Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, today. Joining me now to assess the meaning of Ukraine's presidential election, both as regards the fate of Ukraine and the role of Western powers in the ongoing crisis, is Paul Craig Roberts of the Institute for Political Economy. Roberts also served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in the Reagan Administration. He has spoken out forcefully against the warmongering neoconservatives whom he insists have controlled U.S. foreign policy since the Clinton administration period. And he feels certain that they are willing to provoke Russia by establishing Western control over Ukraine, even if that leads to the brink of or even to war. So let me quote, as he explained in one interview in March, why is Ukraine important? Well, there's the Black Sea naval base that Russia has there. You have eastern Ukraine, which is a former Soviet military-industrial complex. For Washington, they say, look, we can really bring a serious strategic threat to Russia here. We can devalue their nuclear deterrent by putting anti-nuclear bases in Ukraine on their border. So when we put pressure on them, they have to think much harder when they stand up to us because we will have the upper hand. So that's the real reason for what they're doing. There are other economic reasons. They want to get their hands on Ukraine. They want to loot it. Paul Craig Roberts, do you have any reflections immediately on the election of Poroshenko and where we're going in Ukraine?
Well, it's a very funny result, isn't it? Because according to the propaganda from Washington and the American media, Yanukovych had to be thrown out because he was an oligarch and corrupt and had too much money. So what did they do? They replaced him with another corrupt oligarch who has too much money. In fact, I believe this Poroshenko figure has even more money than Yanukovych. At least his palace is every bit as sumptuous as Yanukovych's. So it's not clear in terms of the Western propaganda what has changed. You know, the Italian author Giuseppe di Lampedusa, his famous historical novel, The Leopard, he said things have to change in order to remain the same. And it looks like that's what's happened, at least on the surface. One oligarch went out, another came in. Now, the only difference could be that this Poroshenko is allied with Washington, and he intends to get even richer, add another $1 billion or $2 billion, by participating with the West in the looting of the Ukraine. That, of course, would make him even richer. As for the violence, I think that the Russian government, if they actually think that that's going to stop, they may be mistaken, because Washington doesn't want the violence to stop. And unless Poroshenko asserts some sort of independence from Washington, he will continue with Washington's policy, which, of course, is to keep the pressure on the Putin government, so that if the Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine are put down by military force, by violence, and the Russian government doesn't intervene, this would undermine Putin back in Russia. with the nationalists, with people who want to stand up for Russia. On the other hand, if he does use intervention to stop the slaughter of Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine, the Washington propaganda machine will demonize him further and use the demonization to keep the European countries allied with Washington in this endeavor. I think what Putin is hoping is that, look, Europe, pay attention. We're not doing anything. It's Washington, and all this trouble is coming from Washington, and we're reasonable, and we're willing to work with the Ukrainian government, and all of this violence should stop. I think what Putin is trying to do is to perhaps stop the complicity of Western Europe with Washington's plan to give Russian government a permanent problem in the Ukraine, a long-run problem. Now, I can't read the situation any better than Putin, and probably read it a lot worse, but I think what he's basically hoping for is that the important European powers will see that all of this conflict stems from Washington, not from Russia, and that the end result could easily be detrimental to Europe. So that, I think, is a bet that the Russian government has made. If it's a good bet, it'll turn out well. If it's a poor bet, there's a great danger that the Russian government will lose credibility within Russia. And of course, Washington has hundreds of NGOs in Russia that it can put into operation, just as it put them in operation in the Maidan protest in Kiev.
I think some of the Russian government, not only Putin, has been on point in accentuating the degree to which they're willing to tolerate dialogue, encourage dialogue, and be conciliatory. I can quote Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev last week in an interview with Bloomberg. He says, in the future, the main point is to make sure that Ukraine's central de facto authorities and those who live in these parts of Ukraine establish a fully fledged dialogue based on mutual respect and understanding, a dialogue that takes into account the position of eastern Ukraine. He goes on elsewhere to say, let our partners in the dialogue, namely the EU and the United States, guarantee us something. For example, that they won't interfere in Ukraine's internal affairs. Let our Western partners guarantee us that they won't lure Ukraine into NATO, that the Russian language won't be prohibited in eastern Ukraine, and that some senseless movement such as the right sector won't start killing people there. Let our partners guarantee this. So I take it cued from you that the Russians are talking to Europe, not just the U.S., when they do this, demonstrating to Europe that they're willing to facilitate negotiations between all parties.
I think Putin is smart enough to know that talking to Washington is pointless. Washington has no intention of resolving the situation. They want it alive because it undermines Putin and undermines the Russian position in the world. And Washington is trying to use it to keep Germany and France and the UK firmly allied with Washington in starting a new Cold War in which Russia has now been given the role of the Soviet Union, and it justifies ongoing heavy military security complex expenditures that Washington is so dependent on. So I don't think Putin is relying on any sort of goodwill from Washington, but I think he is hoping that the Europeans will see it's not in their interest to represent Washington's interest in a situation that causes loss, economic or political, to them. So that's his bet. And so the whole question is, who will end up with the most influence on the Europeans? Will it be Putin's goodwill, his unprovocative behavior, his willingness to stand provocations from Washington, or will it be Washington? Will Washington be able to continue the subservience of Europe that it's had ever since World War II? So that the outcome of that determines the result. Now, if Germany, for example, says, look, we don't want any more of this. We have all these relations with Russia, and they're not doing anything, and we don't want them jeopardized, and so we don't support this, then Putin wins. But if Merkel is well paid and subservient as the British Prime Minister, then she'll simply stick with Washington. And Putin runs the risk of being discredited inside Russia with the nationalists who want to see Russia standing up for Russian people in Ukraine. So the outcome is not clear. And all we know for sure is that Washington has no interest whatsoever in resolving the conflict.
Can I ask you, in the moments we have left, for thoughts on the Russia-China rapprochement? It's not as though it happened overnight. Russia and China had been speaking for a long time, but there may be more urgency now, and they signed something like $400 billion deal to send Russian natural gas to China. The assumption is, or one interpretation is, I'll quote from, I think it's Robert Perry, writing in Consortium News, the two longtime adversaries who faced off as communist rivals during the Cold War have joined together recently as a bloc on the United Nations Security Council to block Western initiatives on Syria, for instance. That means that instead of isolating Russia at the UN, the State Department's hawkish approach to Ukraine has had the opposite effect. Russia now has a new and powerful ally. Is it possible that the aggressiveness the U.S. has shown in Ukraine could be backfiring? You've painted the scenario where Putin could be under stress in Russia, could be discredited with nationalists and face resistance inside fomented by the U.S. Is it possible to look at this as maybe a fiasco for U.S. foreign policy? Maybe it's time to close the book on the neocons, not that they're going away, but maybe Ukraine has really rebounded in ways that they didn't expect.
That's entirely possible. I've often wondered why it's taken China and Russia so long to form a strategic alliance when Washington has made it completely clear for years that its intention is to prevent the rise of both countries. And we know for a fact that Washington is surrounding Russia with military bases, and we know for a fact that Washington is surrounding China with military bases. Washington is creating new air and naval bases so that Washington can control the flow of resources in the South China Sea. Washington is, again, cultivating the Philippines to get back into Subic Bay. They're building a new naval base on a South Korean island. They're dealing with Vietnam, with Thailand, Australia. So when you have two countries faced with very aggressive encirclement by military bases, you would have thought the two had gotten together a long time ago in order to offset this. And of course, the greatest foundation of Washington's power is the dollar as world reserve currency, because it lets Washington print money to pay its bills. There's really no limit on Washington's ability to issue debt, because being the reserve currency, every country is willing to hold debt denominated in dollars. So when China and Russia make a deal and they say, okay, we're going to trade with one another in our own currencies and we're not going to use the dollar payments mechanism, this is a signal to other countries that they can do the same thing. But the real puzzle to me is why it took so long. Why? For so many years did China and Russia continue to support Washington's power over them by using the dollar payments mechanism. It really doesn't make any sense. It's almost like the two governments didn't comprehend how they could protect their independence, their own sovereignty. But apparently now they've caught on, and we see this new agreement. Now I suspect it will spread, if only for economic reasons, because when you use the dollar system, you have to exchange your currency into dollars in order to make payment to the other country, and the other country then has to change the dollars back into its currency. So you have these two commissions on exchange rate transactions in foreign exchange markets, and that's expensive. There's no reason for countries to have to bear that expense. And if on top of the expense, what you're really doing is supporting the power of someone who's surrounding you with military bases, well, why in the world would you do it?
Right.
So I think we see these two governments perhaps finally waking up to the nature of the threat that they face.
Well, I guess you've left us on a note of hope that the rapprochement between Russia and China may do something to stem the aggressiveness of U.S. military posturing around the globe. I want to thank you for helping us understand what's going on in Ukraine in wider context. Paul Craig Roberts.
Thanks very much.